All right, go ahead and make sure you have found your seat, and if you have not started yet, here are the objectives that you need to start getting written down at the top of your large group handout. All right, while you're writing here, Mr. Linen last week did a great job of outlining some of the attempts at resistance that some of these indigenous communities are going to participate in order to attempt to stop or avoid white encroachment westward. Okay? This week is going to focus on kind of the aftermath. So what happens when those acts of resistance end, okay, or when they can't continue? What happens to the indigenous communities? What kinds of things are they forced into? That type deal. All right, so you got two objectives up there. Identify ways in which the United States forced indigenous people to assimilate, and I'm going to give you a definition for that word here in a second. And then identify the impacts that the process of assimilation had on indigenous people. Okay, so kind of the overall outcomes for these communities that are still impacting a portion of our population today. Okay, so a lot of these indigenous communities are still feeling the impacts or the effects from this time period at the current moment where we're at in U.S. history. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. A lot of these are long-term. Okay, and we'll continue to kind of break down or dissolve some of the communities that these people have access to. All right, we're going to start with just a little bit of review. Again, Mr. Linen went into some of this information last week as well, but just to kind of refocus after break and kind of bring you back to where we're at. Some of the differences between indigenous culture and white American culture are going to create some of the friction between the two groups. A lot of misunderstanding between those two about how the other one operates on a day-to-day, and a lot of that comes from those cultural differences. Okay, so we're going to re-highlight those to start with, and then we'll get into what assimilation actually looks like. I'll get you a definition, and then some of the major things that go on. And again, as always, these are not the only things that are happening at this point in time, but these are the big kind of key focal points throughout this process of assimilation. Okay. All right. Okay, so starting with indigenous culture, and you should have, I think, a couple categories on there. But again, it should be a little bit of a comparison between the two groups here. Okay, so land is the first major difference. Okay. Mr. Linen mentioned this last week, and I mentioned it the very first week of school when we had our very first large group. Okay. In indigenous communities, there is not this idea of land ownership. Okay. Land is not something that can be owned or controlled by one person or a group of people. Instead, it is a resource that is supposed to be used for the betterment of the community. Okay? But there's no putting up fences, there's no staking claims to plots of land. There's no, this is my farming territory, yours is over there. Okay? That doesn't exist in a lot of these indigenous communities. Okay? Now, like Mr. Linen mentioned, that also doesn't mean that they're openly sharing with every single other community around them. Okay, there are going to be a lot of indigenous communities that don't necessarily stake borders or land claims, but they also don't want other tribes or groups coming onto their hunting grounds or onto where they are residing for that season. Okay, so don't misunderstand this, that nobody claims land and then it's all good and moving forward. Okay, there's definitely some conflict that still deals with land. But this idea of land ownership doesn't make sense to a lot of these indigenous people. Okay? The way that white Americans are going to move westward and the things that they're going to do with land is going to be very different from the indigenous communities that are already in those areas just in general. Okay? All right, the next kind of key focus here, and again, this deals a lot with indigenous communities that are in this Midwestern region, so like the Plains area that we currently live in right now. That's kind of the region that we're talking about. Now, there'll be some things that happen to indigenous communities across the entire country, not just in the Midwest, but kind of the ones that we're focused on here during this time period are some of those Midwestern tribes or nations that are residing where we live at the moment. Okay? Now, for the indigenous communities, especially in the Plains, the buffalo or the bison are almost their sole source of survival. Okay? This animal is extremely important. I cannot express that enough, how important this animal is to a lot of the communities living in this region. Okay? The animal provides almost every single one of their basic necessities. What is very different from the way that American culture is going to hunt the bison compared to indigenous culture is how many of the animal they are hunting at a time. Okay? Indigenous communities are very well known for using every single piece of the animal. And when I say every single piece, that's not an exaggeration. Okay? They have a use for the stomach. They have a use for the eyes, the bones, the bone marrow, the bladder, the brain, all of it. Okay? They use the entire animal. It provides housing, it provides clothing, it provides food, and it provides tools that are necessary for them to survive in this area. Okay? So this is just a reference here, I guess, for using every part. Okay? The lining of the stomach naturally holds on to water. It's waterproof almost. Okay? So they would take the lining or the stomach from the bison, they'll pull it out and dry it, and then they use it as a water sack. Okay? So they could actually store and carry fresh water for themselves inside of that piece of the animal. Okay? Not a single part of this animal goes to waste at all. But again, there is a huge reliance on the animal itself in order for these groups of people to survive. When the buffalo goes away, there's a direct correlation with the shrinking of indigenous communities because they no longer have access to the animal that provided them with all of their basic necessities for an extended period of time. Okay. The other piece that comes with buffalo, it has a spiritual tie to it in a lot of these indigenous communities. Okay. So it's more than just this animal that runs around and that they use on a daily basis. Okay. There's a huge spiritual tie into it as well, which is a huge part of their daily lives as well. Okay. So that animal, like I said, I cannot express enough how important this animal is to the indigenous communities that are using it, especially in the plains. All right, and then lifestyle. Like I said, this is going to be relatively different from white American life as well, just in general. Okay? Now, first and foremost, and I would maybe even underline or circle this because it's going to come back later on as important, these people are nomadic, which means they move. Okay? Many of the groups are going to follow bison herds across the plains. Okay? So they're actually following the animal as it migrates to its natural pattern. The people or the groups will follow. Nomadic simply means that you're moving around. You're not sedentary. You don't build a home and stay in one spot. Okay? They're going to move around throughout different points of the year. A lot of them will stay put during winter months, but as soon as it starts to warm up at all, so into the spring, summer, and fall, they're going to move pretty frequently. Okay? Like daily, they will pick up and move their stuff to a new location as they follow these herds of animals. Okay? Now, the other thing that's going to separate indigenous lifestyle from American lifestyle is the role that men and women play in society. Okay, very, very different from what American society recognizes as like those gender roles. Okay. Now, the men in indigenous society, they are responsible for the protection of the community. Okay. That kind of fits with that idea, somewhat fits with the American view of things. Okay. It's the male's responsibility to make sure the home is taken care of, that the community is protected, and that nothing from outside the community is a threat to the internal community. Okay. Now, where the roles switch, though, or where they differ, there are quite a few of these tribes that are actually run by women. Okay? Women have a much larger role in indigenous communities than in white American communities. Okay? They are responsible not only for the upbringing of the children, but they are also responsible for things like education, okay? The way that they educate their children and how the next generation moves into adulthood. A lot depends on the females in that society. Okay? They carry a lot of the historical value with them. We have a lot of indigenous storytellers that are female, which is a huge part of their history and their daily life. Okay, so women have a much bigger role in general, traditionally speaking, in a lot of these indigenous communities. Okay. All right, now where we get the difference or the contrast here. Okay? So American culture, and as Americans move further west, this starts to become more apparent. Okay? Land is the ultimate goal for American culture. Okay? The more land you own, the more money you bring in. The more money you bring in, the more power you have in society. So land is kind of that American dream. It fits with that early version of the American dream, is access to land ownership. And it's fencing it off. It's creating plots of land that are solely based on or for you and your direct family or descendants. Okay? So this idea that you can own land is a huge part of that move westward that doesn't align with what indigenous communities understand about the world around them. Now, with land ownership, and where this starts to create an even bigger rift, is the reliance on agriculture for Americans. Okay? Agriculture, especially in the Midwest and as people move westward, becomes a huge source of profit for these individuals. So again, it kind of fits in with this American dream. Not only do you own land, but you can work the land. Okay? You have the ability to work hard, you can raise or grow crops and livestock, and then you can turn those into a profit for the betterment of your family or your small community. Okay? What agriculture does, though, which is a huge difference, is it creates people who are sedentary. Okay? They don't move. So those moving west and fencing off plots of land and gaining access to these different agricultural areas, they don't move any longer. Okay? They're stationary, they stay put, which is a huge difference between the indigenous communities and the American communities that are heading that direction. All right, and then lifestyle. Okay? Not that some of these traits don't flow between the two groups, okay, but the primary focus in lifestyle for Americans moving westward is hard work. Okay? You can work your way out of a bad financial situation. You can work your way into status in society. Just the harder you work, the better off your life is going to be. Women's role is very limited for a lot of these communities or a lot of these individuals. They're primarily responsible for the home and the children, and outside of that, they don't have any real status in society at this point in time. Again, that's very different from the indigenous communities that hold a lot of reverence for their female members of society. And then kind of the other big difference in lifestyle is this idea that profit and success are what matters in life. Okay? Having financial gain, being someone that has more money than the person next to you, that equals success, and that's the ultimate goal. Okay? So that idea of profit is going to be relatively foreign to the indigenous communities that they're going to run into. All right, you need to get this definition for assimilation written down. Okay? So I'll give you a couple seconds here, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about it. All right, so definition here for assimilation, and then the rest of large group are going to be some examples of assimilation, okay, or how that was used in order to force a group of people, which are those indigenous communities, into a more recognizable way of life from the American standpoint or standard. Okay? So like the definition says up there, assimilation is taking people of different backgrounds or beliefs and absorbing them into the larger community. Okay? Oftentimes this involves the use of force in some capacity. That doesn't mean that assimilation is always a bad thing. Okay? There are some forms of assimilation that will happen somewhat naturally as new members of communities move in and things change. However, in this specific instance, assimilation is a very negative process for the indigenous people that are going to be forced into it. All right, like I said, you guys are going to get some examples now. Okay? So I'm going to give you the three kind of categories we're going to talk about, and then I'll give you some specifics about each one, and then some examples. Okay? So one of the ways that assimilation was going to be used was the conquering or taking of land. Okay? So the more that these American citizens move westward has a direct correlation with the beginnings of the loss of a way of life for the indigenous communities that they are running into. Okay? Again, they are used to moving around frequently. They are used to following herds of animals. They are used to being a little bit more spread out. As people from the United States move and start to lay claim to land and stake things off, it's going to create less and less space for these indigenous communities to move or to fluctuate. Okay? The building of the railroads is going to limit the migration patterns of the bison, which directly limit the ability for these indigenous communities to move. Okay? So there's going to be some things that go with the conquering or taking of land that are going to force that assimilation process forward. Okay, the next one is Americanization, and I'm going to give you a quote right now that you need to write down. Okay? So the quote that we associate with Americanization is, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Okay. It's not up there, but I'll repeat it. Go ahead and write down the quote, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Okay, the idea behind that quote was that they were going to take away the indigenous culture or indigenous way of life from these individuals and then take the person and turn them into an American citizen. Okay, they were going to Americanize these individuals. The picture up there is arguably one of the most famous ones from this time period, and the process of Americanization is shown. The same person is in both images. Okay? You've got the picture of the man as he is with his indigenous community, and then after he goes through that Americanization process, it's the same individual, but looks very, very different. Okay? But again, it's that idea that we need to get rid of that way of life, the cultural standards, we need to get rid of the language, all of that, and we need to replace it with the American way of doing things. Okay? That's essentially what the process of Americanization is going to end up being. All right, and then the last category, and again, you'll get specific examples for each one of these, okay? But the last category that they're going to kind of pinpoint or use pretty heavily is education as a way to assimilate. Okay? Now, education, one of the key things is it focuses on the younger generation. Okay? The older that people get, and I'm sure you guys realize that a little bit, the older you get, you tend to be a little bit more stubborn. Okay? It's a little bit easier to get a kindergartner to do stuff than it is to get your age group to do something. Okay? You guys have more life experience, you have more knowledge, you have more understanding of the world around you, so you don't budge as easily as someone that's younger than you. And the same thing goes as you age. Okay? So part of the goal of assimilation was to target the youngest groups in order to change them. In turn, they would change the next generation. Okay? So they're going to use education as a means to achieve that. All right, like I said here, some specific examples. I'm going to play the video first, and then we're going to talk about the Dawes Act. This would fall under that conquering or taking of land as far as assimilation goes. All right, okay, the Dawes Act. So, like I said in the video, and there's a couple things you'll want to get written down. Okay? First and foremost, it's passed in 1887. Okay? Initially speaking, you don't necessarily need to know this. Initially speaking, it's called the Indian Homestead Act. Okay? So we've already talked about a version of the Homestead Act that dealt directly with those moving west. The idea was to create a somewhat similar situation for some of the indigenous communities. Okay? Now, again, from the U.S. perspective, it sounds like a great thing. They're going to divide up these plots of land and award these individual indigenous people these plots of land. And like I said, depending on what part of the country you were in, it could be anywhere from 40 to 60 acres of land at a time. Now, in reality, this is not a good thing for the indigenous communities at all, by any stretch of the imagination. Okay? So the idea was, again, to break up tribal lands, so lands that some of these tribes had accessed for an extended period of time and for their tribe's history. But they were going to divide them up and create farming plots is the ultimate goal. Okay? Well, there's a couple key issues with it. First and foremost, when the Dawes Act was passed, Okay? The land that was actually given to the indigenous people was not very farmable. A lot of the times they got the worst land, so whether it be somewhat deserty or swampy, very dry or arid, okay, it wasn't land that was actually usable from a farming standpoint. They might get a little bit of crop rotation out of it, but at the end of the day, it wasn't something that was going to be sustainable for the communities that were forced into those areas. Okay. The second problem, they didn't pay any mind to where they moved people. Okay. So whatever plot of land you were given, didn't matter if it was 6 states away from where you had previously been, you had to move to that plot of land if you wanted access to it. Okay. So they didn't pay attention to where tribes had been located previously. They didn't pay attention to where nations had language similarities. Okay. They essentially just divided it up and moved people wherever they wanted to from a federal government standpoint. Next problem, a lot of these people don't know how to farm at that level. Okay. They are not groups that have previously participated in large-scale agriculture. So putting them on a plot of land and telling them they're not allowed to move off of that land and that they're supposed to survive and make a living off the land is a problem. Okay. They don't have the skills necessary to actually utilize the land they were given or to participate in that system of agriculture that so many people that are moving west understand. Okay. So that's a huge negative or a huge drawback. Okay. The other problem with the land, okay, there are a lot of loopholes in the Dawes Act. So there's going to be some things that the federal government and some of the entities that are going to help carry out the Dawes Act are going to put in place that are actually going to negatively impact the communities. Okay, so for example, and we'll talk about boarding schools here in a second, but they would award plots of land to children. Okay, like school-age children would get a 40-acre plot of land. Well, they had to claim it within a specific set of time, so 30 days, 60 days, whatever the time frame was. If they didn't show up at that point in time, the land was then sold to an American citizen. Okay. Problem is, these kids are stuck in boarding schools, so there's no ability for them to go claim the land that they are supposedly given. Okay. That land then in turn would be sold, and now they don't have access to that land either. Okay. So the Dawes Act is not a good thing, like I said, by any stretch of the imagination. Okay. Now, what the Dawes Act is also going to feed into is something known as the reservation system. Okay. The reservation system or reservations still exist in the modern era. Okay. We still have indigenous reservations throughout our country. The size of those over time have shrunk to a very, very small percentage of what they initially were. Okay. But reservation system starts in 1851, so it begins before the Dawes Act is signed. They'll create some federal plots of land that are going to be set aside for these indigenous communities. Okay. Again, from the federal government standpoint, this is a great idea. We're going to help limit conflict between settlers and between indigenous communities. They're going to have their own space, we'll have our own space. Okay? But in reality, the reservations create a system that is extremely oppressive and still has issues right now. Okay? Some of the people coming off of those reservations or that are living on the reservation, there are a lot of socioeconomic issues. There are a lot of neglect issues for the reservation land itself and with some of the individuals. Okay? But what these reservations are, they are plots of land that are going to be given specifically to a tribe or a number of tribes. That land is supposed to be theirs and theirs only. Okay? The federal government doesn't have a lot of access or is not supposed to have a lot of access to the land, nor are people who are settling west. Now, the issue, again, putting someone who had previously been nomadic into a sedentary lifestyle is not going to work out. Okay? Moving to a reservation essentially ends or takes away an entire lifestyle from a group of people. Okay, so again, these are not good places to be. A lot of the times they don't pay attention to what tribes they're combining, so you're going to take two tribes who have had conflict for hundreds of years and you're going to put them on the same reservation land. Okay, well, all that's going to do is lead to closer proximity and you're going to lead more conflict. Okay, so the federal government doesn't do a lot of research or homework when they create these reservations. They are just going to set them up and force people onto them and essentially say good luck. Now, early on, one of the stipulations was that the federal government was going to provide funding and food to the reservations. They were going to provide some of the resources necessary for these individuals to get kind of on their feet, supposedly. That support ends relatively quickly. Okay? The federal government cannot keep up with the amount of resources that are going to be needed to support these people. And they're going to stop sending as many resources, which is going to lead to a lot of hunger, a lot of the tribal members are going to start leaving the reservation lands in order to go hunt, okay, which then you can in turn be arrested, and then that leads to a whole other system of issues. Okay. The map up here, okay, so map of the United States, the orange locations are reservation land. Okay. Those are the reservations that still exist in the United States today that have been awarded to some of the different indigenous communities. As you can tell, there's not a ton. Okay? They are very small plots of land, traditionally speaking. And again, you're going to take groups of people who moved all across our country, and you're going to bunch them all up into very small areas of land. Okay? There's a couple in the state of Nebraska, if you find Nebraska in the middle there. Okay? So we've got the Winnebago, the Santee Sioux, the Omaha. Okay? Those are still reservations that exist in the state today.
Damnation.
Bleak.
Oppression.
Small.
They're beautiful and sad at the same time. It's beautiful because you're surrounded by people that are just like you. But it's sad because everything that affects big cities, whether it's drugs or alcohol or everything's magnified on a reservation. You see it up front, like in your face.
Sick. You know, there's alcoholism, there's abuse, there's domestic violence, there's a lot of things that go on a reservation that really goes overlooked.
Just a compromise. It was an agreement based, forced agreement probably, that Native Americans were put kind of out of the way, out of sight.
Prison. It's like where we're trapped.
I believe it's the most common misconception about reservation.
That there's some kind of abundance, that natives are happy, that they're caring for each other, that they live in some ancient way.
Sad.
Poor.
A concentration camp. Our reservations were made to isolate Indian people and hope that we would die off.
Depressing.
Unfair, because they're not as good as other lands. They're the land that the government and people don't want.
Trapped. It wasn't great farmland, it wasn't great homeland, and so it kind of feels like a place off to the side.
Even to this day, the natives are fighting for rights to keep the little of what they have.
There are no good reservations. Here's your reservation. You can't go across that boundary. This is your reservation. And I grew up on a Navajo reservation, and we're one of the few lucky people that got to remain where our homelands are. But there are other reservations where people were forced there, and they can't fend for themselves like they used to do in the old days. You can't hunt anymore, you can't fish anymore, because you're just stuck on a reservation on these substandard housing, living in third world country conditions. Youths killing themselves because there's no future, there's no hope. That's a reservation to me.
All right, so like I said, not good places to be, and not everything about a reservation is bad. Okay? There's a lot of culture that still exists on a lot of these reservations, a lot of connection to the past, but they are also, like they said in the video, it's essentially the land the federal government didn't want or didn't think that people wanted. Okay? So the land that they're actually living on is not always great land, and it's very hard for them to adapt to that way of life. Okay? All right, like I said, education will be a key focus here as well for that assimilation process. Okay, so just to give you a couple numbers here, there are about 367 indigenous boarding schools that existed in 29 different U.S. states. Okay, now there are boarding schools elsewhere. Canada has some very infamous boarding schools for some of the indigenous tribes that are up in Canada as well. Okay. By about 1926, it was estimated that 83% of indigenous children at one point in their life had attended a boarding school, whether willingly or against their will. Now, this form of education, okay, it's not like being in school for you guys. Okay? These are, again, not places you wanted to be as a kid. Okay? These boarding schools were very infamous for neglect, abuse, sexual abuse. I'm going to talk about an example from the state of Nebraska, but we're also going to see a number of children just completely disappear off the face of the earth. Okay? There's not a lot of family members that actually know where some of these kids ended up or where they are today. There's a lot of grave sites that are located on these grounds as well. Okay? So kind of keep that in mind. But some of the goals of these boarding schools, okay, the first was to eliminate the values and traditions that these indigenous communities hold on to or held on to. Okay? When these kids arrived at boarding schools, everything that made them indigenous, all their culture, their language, their style of dress, everything was forbidden. Okay? They were not allowed to speak their native language, they were not allowed to practice their native customs, and they were not allowed to dress in traditional native clothing. Okay? They were forced to dress more in a lot of places like military uniform, which is kind of what you see in the pictures there. They were forced to speak English, whether they knew the language or not. And some of the punishments that they received if they chose to do other things were beatings, borderline torture, starvation, things like that. Okay? So the punishments for doing things that culturally were a part of who you are were horrendous. Okay? But the ultimate goal was to get rid of those values and traditions that a lot of these indigenous communities held on to and passed from generation to generation. Okay? Like I said, part of the focus was on, and I'm going to put a picture up here in a second. Okay? Part of the focus was to change the younger generation. Okay? They're a little bit easier to deal with, easier at times to manipulate, especially the real young kids. But the other point of these boarding schools was to isolate the kids from their actual families. Okay? If you take them away from the grandparents, the parents, the older siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, whoever it is, that uphold these traditions and values, and they speak the native language, and they do things the way that they had done things, if you take a kid away from all of that and don't allow them to practice any of it, you start to lose some of those items. Okay? Language is a huge thing that gets lost during this boarding school era. Okay? So they're going to isolate the kids from their family. A lot of the times they're going to take kids from one region of the country and they're going to move them to an entirely different region of the country so that it's nearly impossible for them to get home, okay? Because they don't have funding to go anywhere. So example here, Carlisle Indian Boarding School, which is the bigger black dot over here with the words. Okay? Arguably one of the most infamous schools to be operated in the United States. All of those lines are kids from different tribes coming into that boarding school. Okay? So we're looking as far north as up into Canada. You've got kids coming from all regions of the United States and are being forced into that same boarding school. Okay? That isolation takes them away from that connection to their indigenous heritage and their background, which is part of that assimilation process, is removing them from people that were like them and forcing them into a more Americanized way of doing things. All right, the next part of these, you have to give up your Native American identity. Okay? What made you indigenous, that all has to go. Okay? One of the examples that's a little bit easier to point to because it's something you can actually physically see is the length of your hair. Okay? When these children, especially the male children, arrived at the boarding schools, they are forced to cut their hair to an American standard. Okay? So that shorter kind of cropped haircut. This is a huge deal. For a lot of these tribes, the length of your hair has a direct tie-in to your life cycle, the spirituality that you hold, and some of the traditions and values that your family, tribe, nation, whatever you're a part of, holds on to. So cutting the hair is a big deal for them. So forcing them to have, like I said, more of an American-style haircut, they're going to force them into American dress, like you can see up there with that group. They were going to remove that indigenous culture and replace it with American culture was the ultimate goal here for these boarding schools. Okay, we're going to skip the video just for the sake of time here. Okay? So like I said, we've got an example that's about 2 hours from where we are right now. Okay, so about 2 hours from Omaha, there is a boarding school that is called the Genoa, Nebraska Boarding School. Okay, it's in Genoa, Nebraska, which is a little small town. Like I said, about 2 hours from here. This is the 4th largest boarding school placed on non-tribal land in the United States. Okay, so it's an extremely large boarding school. And again, I'm going to get you some numbers here. Okay. There are children from more than 10 states and 40 different tribal affiliations that will walk through those doors. Okay, so again, you have kids coming from different parts of the country. It's going to operate from 1884 to 1934, and you don't necessarily need to know the operation dates, just to kind of keep that in mind. Okay. At any one point in time, they could house about 600 children at a time at this boarding school. Okay. By the time the school is closed, it's estimated that about 4,300 kids will have passed through the doors of this school in Nebraska. Okay. It's about 30 buildings, spans about 640 acres, so it's a relatively large boarding school. Like I said, it's about the 4th largest on non-tribal lands. And they are one of the more notorious ones. Okay. So as of, I think it was about 10 years ago, okay, they found a mass grave that was hidden a little bit off-site with the remains of 80 unidentified children. Okay. There is no, I mean, they're working through the remains still as we speak to try and connect them back to family members and to who they might have been. But there's 80 children who died at this school with no record of them being there or passing away. Okay. They just disappeared as far as their family is concerned. Okay. That's a huge problem. Okay. And a lot of the death from these children, again, ties directly in with starvation, abuse, sexual abuse, some of the diseases that will spread throughout the boarding schools. Okay. It was not, a lot of times not by accident that these kids pass away. Okay. All right, we're going to skip this video here. We got a couple things. Okay, so impact here. Just general system of assimilation overall. Okay, if you look at the map to start with, the purple in 1819 is lands that are occupied by indigenous communities. By 2000, the purple is indicating the same thing. Okay, so you can see the amount of land that they are going to lose throughout this process, whether it be westward expansion or process of assimilation. Okay. This essentially is going to be, this era in American history is going to be deemed a cultural genocide. Okay. It is responsible for the loss of a massive number of languages. Okay. In our country alone, there were more than 500 different dialects / languages spoken. Today, there are less than 170, okay, and that number shrinks pretty rapidly. Okay. I haven't looked in a couple of years, but there's a good chance that it's under 120. Okay. All right, we'll finish up in small group. You'll finish up the last couple things, but make sure you submit these notes, please.